Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you out there in the monitoring and evaluation and today the conflict sensitivity world. Welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. These Thursday Talk webinars on DME for Peace are made possible with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York through our work in the Peace Building Evaluation Consortium. As it's been a while, I just want to make sure you haven't forgotten that I'm Jack Farrell. I'm the DME for Peace project manager at Search for Common Ground, and I'm based in Washington, DC. Today, I'm delighted to welcome my colleague Sweta Velpillay of CDA Collaborative Learning Projects, who's going to lead a discussion on an alternative approach to effectiveness in conflict-sensitive programming. Just a note, you can ask questions throughout the webinar, either by writing it on the GoToWebinar dashboard or clicking on the little hand icon so that we know you're ready to ask your question once we start the Q&A. I'm now going to hand over to today's guest. Sweta, you're very welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Jack. Good morning, everyone. As Jack mentioned, I work for CDA Collaborative Learning Projects as the Senior Advisor for Conflict Sensitivity and Peacebuilding Effectiveness. CDA, as you may already know, is an action research and advisory organization that bridges the gap between theory and practice to improve the effectiveness of peacebuilding, development, and humanitarian organizations, as well as businesses working in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. While CDA has been a thought leader in the area of conflict sensitivity and more specifically in do no harm methodology, in this webinar, I'm going to share with you our approach to effectiveness in conflict sensitivity, specifically in South Sudan. While there are other multi-donor facilities in conflict sensitivity and in risk management, I will focus on insights that we are learning from the Conflict Sensitivity Resource Facility, CSRF, that was set up in 2016. I am representing CSRF and CDA in this webinar today, but I should note that the initiative is jointly implemented by Safer World, Swiss Peace, and CDA. In the next 15-20 minutes or so, I will touch on some of the global trends in conflict sensitivity that we are seeing at the moment, outline the advantages of multi-donor approaches to conflict sensitivity, the role of donors in it, before diving deep into CSRF and what it is doing and our approach to effectiveness there, before taking questions from those of you joining this webinar. We definitely see some new momentum for conflict sensitivity. There are a few global trends that CDA and the consortium members who are part of the Conflict Sensitivity Resource Facility are beginning to observe. For well over a decade now, different aid organizations have been testing new ways to integrate or mainstream conflict sensitivity across programs and organizational practices. Out of this years of effort comes an increasing realization that conflict sensitivity at individual project or program levels alone is not sufficient to see wider changes in practice, wider changes in uptake, levels of uptake, and that integration of conflict sensitivity at country strategy or portfolio levels is critical for seeing significant changes in practice. It is to say that we need to complement existing integration efforts with a top-down approach, if you could call it that. In terms of aid accountability, there is renewed push for accountability upwards, but also downwards towards affected populations in humanitarian development and peacebuilding fields. This is providing new energy for looking at conflict sensitivity more holistically. Similarly, there's also new policy momentum for collective approaches, shared analysis, joint strategies that give a new push for conflict sensitivity. For example, at international policy level, SDGs and the Goal 16, UN Sustaining Peace Agenda, more recently Pathways for Peace, have been talking about conflict sensitivity and the nuances of programming in conflict-affected contexts. Similarly, do no harm is integrated into larger policy commitments such as the Grand Bargain. And this is all, again, providing a new momentum for conflict sensitivity, and it's a trend that we're seeing. And the last observation that we have is that adaptive management as a discourse, something that we've been talking about a lot in the past few years, puts unintended negative impacts front and center, which adds impetus to conflict sensitive programming. And all of this is shifting our thinking a little bit on how to approach conflict sensitivity slightly differently. However, in general, entry points for conflict sensitivity is still seen through the work of implementing partners. That's the general trend. However, in South Sudan, and specifically for the donors that we are working with, there is a heightened recognition that international aid, be it assistance programs or policies that direct those programs, have an impact on conflict dynamics in South Sudan. For example, at systemic level, certain patterns of development assistance could reinforce or reflect patterns of existing marginalization. The way aid is designed and delivered interacts with markets and conflict economies. At the institutional level, distribution models and patterns may challenge or reinforce systems of power, accountability, patronage, and control of resources. At the more local, micro level, aid programs could be legitimizing claims by any particular group over land, power, or resources. So it's not possible to look at conflict sensitivity without looking at the role and the potential for donors to impact conflict dynamics. So what are some of the benefits of multi-donor approaches to conflict sensitivity? First of all, it's the pooled resources that comes in from multiple donors enable the development of common conflict sensitivity principles that the donors and their implementing partners can stand behind. It also enables joint analysis, shared capacity development initiatives, and collective learning both at project level, but also at strategic level. It is an incentive for joint action rather than fragmented standalone initiatives to improve conflict sensitivity. Secondly, more coherent and consistent engagement of local and implementing partners in conflict sensitivity is one of the benefits of multi-donor approaches. Thirdly, there's the use of peer review processes or mechanisms to support accountability, both upwards, downwards, but also sort of lateral accountability to hold each other accountable, the donors themselves to hold each other accountable for their conflict sensitive practices. And lastly, a shared support structure that comes from a joint structure, joint multi-donor facility enhances the strategic collaboration among the donors, but also among implementing partners. Some of them are funded by multiple donors. This also increases efficiency, not just effectiveness, but also efficiency and the value for money. So what is CSRF and how are we promoting conflict sensitivity through it in South Sudan? Like I said, it's a multi-donor facility funded by DFID, Global Affairs Canada, embassies of Switzerland and Netherlands. It is implemented by World, Swiss Peace and CDA and was set up in 2016. And the pilot phase will come to an end in December of 2018, in a few months. It was set up following the unrest of 2013, driven by the concerns about the complexity of aid delivery in South Sudan, and that recognition that it can't be business as usual and that there needs to be a different approach to aid delivery in the country. The beneficiaries of the program are the 4 participating donors, Switzerland, Canada, UK, and Netherlands. 11 of their implementing partners are NGOs, as well as 10 national NGOs. The purpose of the CSRF is to establish and monitor and disseminate conflict-sensitive practices among donors and implementing partners. The goal of the program, staying true to conflict sensitivity, is that aid programs are conflict sensitive and support peace and do not exacerbate existing tensions or divisions. How do we do this? We do this through a combination of creating conflict sensitivity knowledge through research analysis, facilitated reflection exercises, and finding ways for organizations that we work with to apply that knowledge through institutional assessments, institutional capacity strengthening, which could take the form of training, workshops, accompaniment, mentoring, sitting down with program teams and reviewing project or program documents, and in-depth conflict audits and mapping exercises. This is facilitated by ongoing learning and reflection at certain points of the program. What are some of the achievements of the program and challenges along the way in this pilot phase in relation to the outcome of the program, what it set out to achieve, but also in the context, given the context in which the program is implemented. Some of the successes are that in addition to the planned activities such as the institutional assessments, capacity strengthening, and research activities, the program now responds to specific requests from the donors to fulfill important conflict sensitivity gaps as seen by them in their programs and operations. So the program has now gone beyond sort of planned activities to responding to emerging needs, being very nimble and adaptable. Second success that I would like to highlight is during the pilot phase, the project has had extensive online, in-country and regional outreach with wider international community, both donors and NGOs, as well as researchers and practitioners to further the conflict sensitivity discourse in South Sudan. The online repository that is hosted by South Sudan Peace Portal is widely accessible. Anybody can access the resources that is held in that portal. It supports greater contextual knowledge for various actors working in or on South Sudan. The third success, as we see it, is apart from the meta-analysis that we did and that is accessible in the repository, the program has also produced several research products on issues considered to be a priority for actors working in South Sudan, particularly the donors, towards helping them design and deliver aid programs. The last success, I would say, is while the primary beneficiaries are the 4 participating donors and some of their implementing partners, based on the needs on the ground, the program has now extended its support to national NGOs through trainings and mentoring. So in many ways, sort of branching out from what was originally envisaged to much deeper and wider reach in South Sudan. Of course, the program is not without its share of challenges. Staff turnover within the donor institutions mean the program almost needs to hit reboot every time there's staff transition. The key challenge here is retaining institutional memory and institutional learning of conflict sensitive practices and systems within these organizations. The program has a specific learning component. However, managing these learning spaces in a fragile context where planning beyond a few weeks at any time is already difficult has been particularly challenging. The last challenge that I would like to highlight is for significant uptake in conflict sensitive practice, there needs to be efforts focusing at individual, organizational, and systemic levels. And yet, balancing conflict sensitivity efforts, targeting at these 3 levels, finding the optimal configuration within time and resource limitations and the uncertainties in the operating environment has been quite challenging. The program strives to generate South Sudan specific understanding and learning from practice, as well as finding optimal ways to apply that understanding to see significant changes or changes in conflict sensitive practice in the country. While there is ample collective experience within the peacebuilding community, as well as the 3 consortium members on different ways for improving conflict sensitive practice in terms of programs, policies, and operations, we also recognize that there is really no one-size-fits-all in South Sudan, even among the participating organizations of the program. The so-called magic ingredient in all of this is really creating spaces for interaction, creating spaces for learning, testing lots of new methods, lots of different tools, and then adapting each of them the next time we need to use something. So testing and adapting as we go. We do this in a few different ways. We convene discussions through roundtables, presentations, working groups. We produce quite a few tools specifically on particular conflict sensitivity areas, thematic concerns that might be emerging, or more broadly. We produce tools and toolkits, fact sheets, policy briefs, analysis, and maps. In terms of online outreach, there is the research repository, the research updates that go out to anyone who signs up. And then there are multiple dissemination events. And all of these are tried and tested, and one thing is never really used in the same shape or form again without adapting, simply because it just doesn't work that way. The last thing that I would like to highlight is creating informal connections has proven to be such an important part of our approach to conflict sensitivity in South Sudan. It is connecting questions with existing ideas that might already be there in the country, in Juba, building interest and enthusiasm for conflict sensitivity, being proactive about it, and encouraging cross-donor, implementing partner, and academic networks to keep this discussion going and to help organizations and representatives of the organizations we work with to think critically, to internalize what conflict sensitivity means to them, and then translate that into their day-to-day work. For CSRF, in a fragile and dynamic context such as South Sudan, approaching conflict sensitivity holistically, strategically, and from a country perspective, top down, if you can call it that, especially with more than one donor on board, has meant that we're able to address conflict sensitivity considerations and challenges much more effectively, rather than if we were to approach conflict sensitivity through an individual project or individual program, or even if we were to choose a particular geographical location. So that's a quick rundown of the CSRF and what we mean by effectiveness through multi-donor facilities for conflict sensitivity in South Sudan. I am happy to take any questions that might be out there.
Thank you very much, Sweta, for a great presentation and introducing us all to the CSRF. To our audience, we're now on to the fun part. We're now going to open up today's presentation to questions. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday Talks. You can submit a question one of two ways. The first is through the question function on GoToWebinar, which will allow you to type your question. The second is to click on the hand button to raise your hand, and that will allow us to unmute your microphone so that you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. Just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DM for Peace, so those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and the discussion and learn from our wider participation. So the questions are already coming through, but one of the questions that sort of struck me, Sweta, during the presentation was you're working with a number of donors here who might have different interests when it comes to sort of different specific focuses of their work when it comes to funding a facility like this. And I was wondering, how have you dealt? I know you addressed some of the challenges, but how have you dealt with sort of different donor interests in a facility like this? Or do you find that the overarching goal of improving the effectiveness of conflict-sensitive programming tends to drive people's focus?
Thanks, Jack. Actually, the latter of what you said is what we are seeing in South Sudan and with this particular facility. The donors who come on board have a desire to change the way in which they program in South Sudan. So the desire for conflict sensitivity and conflict sensitive programming in many ways overrides some of the tensions that may exist. That is not to say that the tensions don't exist. I think when we come down to sort of individual research areas or thematic focus areas, that's probably where we see some of the in negotiations, trying to take on board different viewpoints and different interests, priority areas. For example, one donor might have a very big humanitarian program and therefore would like us to focus our research efforts on that, whereas somebody else might be doing a more development programming and would like us to focus on that. So trying to navigate and renegotiate that happens at one level lower, but overarching recognition that there needs to be a change in the way programming is done in South Sudan is the one thing that brings all the donors together.
Thank you, Sweta. We have a raised hand to kick off our Q&A from the audience. Syed Aman Ali, your microphone is now live, so please feel free to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. This is Aman. I'm from Frontier Design Group, which is a development consulting company based in DC. It's a very good presentation, and I have a question from Sweta that in your presentation you was emphasizing a lot that you tried and tested a lot of product. So I was wondering that if you can share your experience, that have you or are you able to develop some standard mechanisms or procedures at the organizational level when you were testing those products? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. We have tested a few standard operating procedures, not for an entire organization, but perhaps for a specific team. So for a humanitarian team within one particular institution, how should they, for example, a very practical example is how should they go about recruiting in a conflict sensitive way without reinforcing some of the marginalization that might already exist. And so that was one, on the operation side of things, we were able to come up with very practical way of developing something that was useful for the organization. On the programmatic side of things, we've done conflict audits for specific thematic areas. Again, it couldn't be sort of, retrofitted to another donor organization. It has to be very specific to the donor with whom we worked on in this conflict audit. And we developed something that they can now go ahead and use independent of the facility, perhaps with a little bit of feedback, a little bit of accompaniment. But it definitely, we have tried it. We have, first time is always a little bit, you have to try and test a few attempts to find the right configuration, the length, the right language, what has traction within those organizations, what sort of stimulates people's thinking to take it to the next level. But yes, we have definitely tried it both in program sense, but also on the operational side of things.
Great, thank you, Sveta, and thank you, Aman, for asking your question live. It's always great to hear from you guys directly. Our next question comes from Seamus Anderson of World Vision International, and Seamus asks, what kinds of things do you measure to see what impact the conflict-sensitive approach has on project outcomes?
Sorry, can you repeat that question again, please?
No problem. What kinds of things do you measure to see what impact the conflict-sensitive approach has on project outcomes?
So we're not working on individual programs of the we're not, the conflict sensitivity research facility does not measure the effectiveness of the programs the donors or implementing organizations have going at the moment. We're obviously not an M&E facility. We would like to see monitoring. We would like to see a monitoring evaluation of conflict sensitivity, and that remains a gap, not just for the CSRF, also for wider conflict sensitivity field, if I could say that. But we don't necessarily go in and see, okay, we have done X number of trainings for this particular team. How has that transpired in terms of effectiveness, conflict sensitivity effectiveness on the programs they manage or implement? Instead, what we have our own markers for conflict sensitivity effectiveness in the way we engage with the donors and implementing partners. So we do surveys, we do reflection exercises to see what kind of support we are providing and how does that translate to change in practice within donor institutions. So to give you an example, we had a research product, a few roundtables on that research product, presentations and so on, and that then meant a particular donor institution said, hold on a second, we need to review program X in location Y because of this particular research that we have just come across, and we need to take stock and slightly change our approach because some things may not be going as well as they should. So that's the way in which we approach effectiveness vis-a-vis CSRF, but we don't directly go and look at partners programs to see how that's having an impact, how they are having an impact on their programs. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Great, thank you, Sveta. Our next question actually feeds on from that a little bit, and it comes from Etta Kanini. And Etta asks, how have you been able to share data for monitoring your activities considering your different organizations? Do you have a common database? Do you have regular meetings? What is it you guys do?
It is a challenging thing to do with monitoring evaluation across different organizations. There's three organizations working on CSRF, and we have a small team in Juba, and the rest of us are based in our respective headquarters. We do have a common log frame. We do have a reporting template that are used by all three organizations to record data on a quarterly basis, and then one organization consolidates all of that and makes sense of it before feeding it into the standard reporting template we have for the program. So yes, there is a common data collection tools that we are using, and we do it every 3 months. We try to do it every 3 months so that nothing falls through the cracks, especially because the program is spread across, the staff are spread across.
And speaking to this a bit further, given DMP's sort of a knowledge sharing platform, I just wondered, like you mentioned in your presentation about your dissemination tactics and how you share this information. How is it you guys tend to share sort of the content from the CSRF? How is it like? Do you do regular learning events, or do you guys use any sort of different sort of webinar methods or podcasts, for example?
So there are different types of dissemination tools that we're using. First one is for the participating organizations, so the donors, the implementing partners, and the national NGOs who are part of the CSRF at the moment. There are different types of trainings, learning events, reflection exercises that we do to keep the conversation going and to enable cross-learning among organizations. And even within that, we sometimes have one that are slightly more strategic level targeting more senior staff, and then we have another one that are with implementing program managers and program officers. Then taking one step away from those sort of the core participants of the program, we then have in-country events that are open to practitioners, aid organizations working in Juba. That could be trainings, that could be presentations that come out of research that we have done, learning events that we hold, that could be learning events and reflections on specific thematic areas like conflict analysis and conflict sensitivity, or what does procurement mean? What does conflict sensitivity mean for procurement? So things that are very targeted. Then there might be other learning events where we might bring in an external resource person to talk about, again, a specific issue. What does war economy mean? How does aid programs alter local economies? So that could be, that's slightly open to others who are working in South Sudan. And then, of course, there are other events that take place, outreach events that take place outside of Juba, more regionally. That doesn't happen very often, but sometimes there might be a conference or a learning event hosted by a different organization. Apart from all of this, then of course we have the online repository, which has all of the CSRF developed, produced resources, research material, toolkits, but also everything that exists at the moment on South Sudan is stored there. And so it's open to everyone. So for us, dissemination happens at multiple levels, and we're quite, again, coming from, trying, testing, adapting. All of these dissemination methodologies are targeted at different audience for us, and it changes depending on who it is we are targeting.
Yeah, I guess my next question then, Sweta, would relate to the potential to scale this idea further. You mentioned in your presentation that this is one of a number of different conflict-sensitive research facilities that could exist around the world from different donors. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, is there any plan, is there a potential for scaling this to other countries, other regions, or do you find that right now this is quite specific to South Sudan and the region itself?
We definitely know that there is a conflict sensitivity facility in Libya. There are some discussions for something similar. This is not for this particular consortium, but implemented by other organizations. One in Libya, these discussions of something similar, I believe in Syria. There is a risk management office in Nepal. There is a similar risk-related facility in Somalia. So there are others, not always conflict sensitivity, because conflict sensitivity is quite different from risk management. So I don't want to conflate the two. They are two very different things. But there are multi-donor facilities already existing, focusing on different things. For us, the pilot program comes to an end in December. Ideally, we would like to see this scale to full-on implementation phase 2, if we could call that. But it's up to the donors, so we'll have to wait and see.
Great, thank you, Sweta. And just a reminder, you can click on the hand icon to ask a question, or you can type your question so we can ask Sweta live. The next question comes from Nathan Bala, and Nathan has asked, and Nathan, apologies if I butcher your question. Do you consider that the design and approach of the CSRF is for a specific range of conflicts or for a broad range? So I think what Nathan is asking, are you looking at it as sort of narrow group of conflicts, or are you looking at conflict more broadly?
We're definitely looking at conflict more broadly. We're not categorizing which types of conflicts. that we want to focus on, because conflict sensitivity interacts with conflicts at different levels. Your project might be interacting with very local, farmer, herder, or pastoralist conflict, versus it could also interact with national level actors, and who's benefiting from aid programs and who's being excluded from your aid program. So we don't categorize conflict as such. However, in some of the research and mapping exercises, we have chosen to take one particular conflict simply because there was a lot of activity going on in that particular area, whether it's geographical area or issues that are very closely related to programs that are implemented by either the implementing partners or the donors. So we may choose particular conflicts to study and unpack, and how aid programs interact with that particular conflict, but that's with a very specific reason, because that is exactly what we want to study. But for overall, as a program, there is no categorization as to which conflicts we approach.
Great. And Sweta, just before we begin to wrap things up today, I was wondering if you could sort of let people know about what the sort of web address is, as well as sort of where they could find more information around CSRF.
Sure. So I could just pull that up. The CSRF, all the resources are stored in the online repository for South Sudan, which is called the South Sudan Peace Portal. If you log into www.csrf-southsudan.org, or if you simply Google CSRF South Sudan, you will be taken right to that web page where you can see all the material.
Great, and I just included a link to the entire audience, which is available in your chat function. And as we're running up on sort of time today, I just want to do sort of a couple of sort of housekeeping bits and pieces for the DME Peace community. Firstly, thank you, Sweta, for an amazing presentation. I can't wait to sort of see what comes of the CSRF, and as well as fingers crossed that it moves beyond the pilot phase. And thank you for being so open during the question and answer session. Secondly, thank you to every member of today's audience for joining this edition of the Thursday Talks. The recording will be posted online on the DME for Peace Media Gallery later today, so you're able to return to it and share it with your colleagues. And please feel free to continue the discussion in the comments. We're going to be back next week with Debbie Trent, who's going to host a discussion on widening participatory dialogue to improve impact in diplomacy and peace building. And I'm really excited for that discussion, and I'm really excited for you to join us then. Thank you again, Sweta. I hope everyone has a great rest of your week, and thank you all for joining the Thursday Talks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.